Hello everyone, and welcome to the part 2 of comparing arrays to array lists. In this case, we're going to look specifically at how we code them. So the previous video we looked at theoretically how they're different and kind of what can be pros and cons of how we're storing data in them, and now we're going to look at the exact coding differences. So first we're going to start with required libraries. In order to use an array, you don't actually require any libraries. So none are required. However, you may find it useful to import java.util.arrays. Specifically, the most common one that people are using there is arrays.toString, which allows you to convert your array to a string, which makes it really nice for printing, but you don't need to do that. You can just write a loop to print, and it works just as well. For ArrayList, you do actually require an import. You must import java.util.ArrayList in order to use it. Note, if you ever are looking at examples, you might see java.util.star, and that's saying import everything within the utilities library. So everything in java.util gets imported. That's what star means. It kind of means match everything. So in that case, you would get arrays, and you would get ArrayList, and you would get a bunch of other things as well. So once we have that imported for ArrayList or not imported for arrays, you want to look at some of the different operations you're going to need to do. So for an array, to find the number of elements in the array, remember we're assuming that an array called A was declared and an array list called A was declared. So the name of either one is going to be A. So in this case, A.length is going to give us the length of A. And for an array list, we're going to use .size, which is a function call, so it requires brackets. The next thing we're going to look at is accessing a specific element, so an element at a given index. In the case of in the case of an array, we're going to do A at index. And in the case of an array list, we're going to do A.get at index. Now for both of these, we are going to see that index needs to be a value between 0 for the first element up to, but not including the length of the array. So length minus 1. Again, you can find the length or the size, which is the number of elements either way, using these ones. Okay, adding elements. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting, and we can look at some different things that we need to consider. So when we are looking at adding elements, there's a couple different types that we're going to see. So we're going to first look at adding elements to the end of an array or array list. So what we're going to see is that for an array, you can't. It's not applicable. You can't add elements past the end of an array. You can create a new array and copy the elements over. So if you get to the maximum size of your array, you can create a bigger array, copy all the elements over, and then add your element to the new array. So I wouldn't really call that adding an element, but it is what we would do in that process. For an array list, it's nice and simple because it's dynamic and it grows as you add elements. You can go ahead and just say a.add and whatever your element is that you're adding. Okay. The next thing you might want to do is, okay, so we can add a new element, but what about updating or changing an element? So what if we do have null spots in our array and we want to add something or we want to change a value? So in a array, we're going to do A at index equals the new element that we're adding. For an array list, we're going to go ahead and use a.set. We're going to pass the index and the element. So those are how we can update or change a value. Both of them are similarly, in terms of writing code, not that different. Inserting an element at an index. So when we're talking about inserting an element at an index, we're saying, say you had a ordered list. So we had an ordered list of animals. In this case, we had bird, dog. We had an empty spot. We want to add in cat, okay? But we want to keep our list alphabetical. So we want to add cat in here. Cat should go at index 1. How are we going to do that? So with an array, what you have to do is you have to, step 1, copy dog over. So you'd have to copy all of your elements over. In this case, we only have to copy 1, but you can imagine if we had a longer array, we would have to copy quite a few elements. And 2, at A1, we would insert cat. And that's how we would do that. So if there's no empty spaces in our array, if our array is already full, then we go back to adding an element, which requires making a bigger array and copying elements over. In an array list, because it's all references to objects, we can go ahead and just add a specified index, an element. So that add function can either be with just an element, like we did above, or we can pass it an index if we want it in a specific spot. So without the index, it'll just add it to the end. With the index, it will put it at the index spot. The last thing that we want to talk about here in terms of coding is removing elements from an array or array list. So for an array, because it is that fixed size, we can't really remove elements. So we can't really remove elements. What we can do is set values to null and essentially make like spaces empty, but the size of the array always remains the same. You can't actually shrink the array. Kind of like adding, you could make a smaller array and copy the elements over, but again, it's a process. It's not like a built-in functionality. With an array list, you kind of have 2 options. If you want to remove a single element, you can use a.remove, and you can pass it an index to say which element you want removed. You can actually remove objects as well. If you just want to remove a single element, so if you just want to remove a single element, that remove will work perfectly. If you want to remove all of the elements in an array, you can use a.clear. And that will go ahead and remove every value from your array, or array list, sorry. In your array list, these 2 functions, the remove and the clear, will change the size. In the case of an array in the case of an array, so an array list, it changes the size. In the case of an array, size always remains the same because it's a fixed static data structure. One quick note for something you'll run into, you might see things referring to iterables or comparables when you're looking at these arrays and array lists on online sources. Some of that is beyond the context of this course, but if you come across anything in particular that you're confused about or want to ask questions about, please feel free to ask.